this evening or this day, wherever you're tuning in from. We're very excited to present this section of the event. It means a huge amount to us. My name is Belle Jacobs. I'm a former fashion editor turned fashion activist, and I am also co-founder of what I consider really an extraordinary group of thinkers called Fashion Act Now. Fashion Act Now is a community of activists, practitioners, creatives, problem solvers, concerned citizens taking on the creative brief in fashion to decouple our clothing culture, the dominant clothing culture, from the ideology of growth. Our background is from Extinction Rebellion. We grew out of the Extinction Rebellion fashion team. So in all of our work, we carry with us this sense that our time on Earth is radically challenged by human activity. So the title of the event tonight is Defashion, a strategy of radical care of people and planet. And for those who are thinking about this term defashion, it is absolutely key to our thinking. And we will have an explanation of it later on, and we will be exploring all of its permutations and implications as well. What does defashion mean on this planet today? So we obviously would love to thank State of Fashion for this wonderful opportunity to join this online event. But not only that, but also the extraordinary event that's happening in the Netherlands now, which is really rewriting so much of what we consider fashion. The program tonight includes three really key moments for the Fashion Act Now team. First of all is the launch of the word defashion, as I said. The second part, or the second highlight for us, will be the premiere of two short films that you'll be watching later on. And I'll go more into those later on, but they are really, really key to our work. They're full of emotion and they're very important documents, and they will be available tonight on the Fashion Act Now website after this event. Thirdly, we'll be launching the common market, and you'll be hearing more about that later. Viewers in the general broadcast may use the open chat to comment and leave questions. And I'll now go into the first part of our program. The very first part, the first hour, will be highlighting voices from the Pluriverse. More explanation on the term Pluriverse later. And this is in this section that the two short films will be shown. After that, first of all, we will actually be introducing our ideas about Fashion Act Now. Then we'll go into the voices from the Pluriverse. And in the last half hour, we have an open discussion in which we want to share views and experiences and find out exactly what defashion means on this planet, in this world today, and also how can we support a post-fashion Pluriverse. In this first section, where we explain Fashion Act Now's ideologies and concepts, its theory of change, I would like to invite Sarah Arnold, co-founder with me of Fashion Act Now. And Sarah is an extraordinary environmental activist. She previously founded a fashion rental platform, Hire Studio, to incentivize a circular economy. But when the 1.5 IPCC report was released in 2018, a really key moment for everyone concerned about the climate, where it was stated that we have only 12 years left to prevent runaway climate change, it became clear to Sarah that more pressure was needed to scale environmental initiatives quickly. This led her to coordinating actions for Extinction Rebellion that challenged the fashion industry, including a really iconic funeral that was held in front of the British Fashion Council's London Fashion Week. In 2020, she and I co-founded Fashion Act Now, and Fashion Act Now coined this term defashion, we'll keep coming back to this term, to describe the urgent downscaling of resource and energy use that is required in the fashion industry today. And now I'm very pleased to pass over to Sarah Arnold. With thanks.
Hello, hi, and thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Belle. So right now I'm going to explain a little bit about the key themes that we founded Fashion Act Now on, and which we'll hear far more about in the coming 2 hours. And we call this short talk that we're doing the urgent case for defashion now. And you're probably thinking, well, what really does defashion mean? And what does fashion mean? So we'll try to unpack that a little bit. See if I can change the slide. There we go. So we at Fashion Act Now are a community of around 40 activists that are working both internationally and locally on a mission to defashion our planet. We work locally on local issues, looking at local communities, but also coming together online to work out how we can provide solidarity with one another and look at the commonalities in those things that we are facing on a local level. Fashion Act Now has evolved out of Extinction Rebellion, our work within Extinction Rebellion, as Belle has explained. But now as a sister group, it has its own aims, tactics, and ways of organizing. Our work is a response to work that has come previous, and I don't want to make it out as though our work is completely original. We have based it on the work that has come before, most notably on post-growth fashion and Earth Logic, the work of Kate Fletcher and Matilda Tam, the work on degrowth by Jason Hickel and Yorgos Kallis. We also believe that we need deep colonization of fashion. And there we reference the work of Sandra Neeson, who's here today on this event. So you'll hear more directly from her, and the work of RCDF, the Research Collective for Decoloniality in Fashion. And we also believe that we need to promote the commons. And there we look at the work of David Bollier and also the work of Amy Twigger-Holroyd, where she looks at the commons in respect to fashion specifically. We've come together as a group with really what seems quite a simple ask. And I think all of you joining here today will agree on this simple ask, that of clothing cultures that nurture people and planet. But we also come together to stand against fashion. And when we talk about fashion, we give it a capital F. This is a specific type of fashion. This is not the human universal of adorning the body and that of dress, but of fashion as the dominant globalized system, an industrial system that is predicated on growth, that is entwined with our economic system that is based upon growth. And in that, it is based upon injustice too. We believe there is an urgent case for defashion. It is said that the material throughput of fashion needs to decrease by 75 to 95% to bring it into the carrying capacity of this planet, our home. And we believe that doing that really needs to happen in the next decade because this is a true emergency. And if that vast change happens, we believe that when we come out the other side of it, what we have is a paradigm shift so vast that it is no longer fashion. And therefore, we call it a process of defashioning. So what is it, this fashion with a capital F? We say that fashion is clothing culture that has been hijacked by economic growth. And on this slide, we have two very opposing images. That on the left of a Batak weaver from North Sumatra, Indonesia, which, by the way, we will hear more about later on in this event. Now, she is creating cloth that she will dress herself in, or she will dress her community in. And that process is part of a ritual, a spiritual ritual, that of creating sacred meaning. The process of creation is about the needs and the desires of the community, what that community thinks it needs to communicate. Now, this is completely opposing to what stands the other side of it. Now, this is a picture of Bernard Arnault when Forbes reported that during the pandemic, for a short space of time, he became the world's richest man. And this is a man, like many other white men, who have profited from kind of emulating this process of culture to create economic growth and to design planned obsolescence for the profit of the rich. And what you have is, instead of sacred meaning, you have then, instead of spirituality, you have it replaced with materialism. You have vacuous symbolism for the sake of designing planned obsolescence. So we see here that this capital F fashion is a social construct. We have created it as humans, and ultimately we have the control to change it. And here we have a picture of an Extinction Rebellion activist who hijacked the Louis Vuitton catwalk show. And these catwalk shows are really a demonstration of the fashion industry's ability to exploit our insecurities in order to grow. What you have here is fashion promising this myth that it will provide relevancy and status that will lead to a sense of belonging and worth. It's notable that when the German sociologist Jörg Simmel described the dynamic of fashion back in 1904, in which, by the way, many fashion theorists still use this same description of fashion because it still stands today. He described a process of two opposing forces, that of differentiation and distinction, and on the other hand, that of equalization. And you can imagine back in 1904, him looking at the upper classes who wanted to be distinct from the rest of society, and therefore created new styles of dress to enforce that distinction. And then over time, other people in society adopt the same style of dress, and those that want to be distinct are no longer distinct, and therefore form a new style of dress. And as Jörg Simmel says, as fashion spreads, so does its doom. You have this obsolescence built into this dynamic. And it is really a dynamic, that of class distinction. But instead, defashion can provide, through community, through creating as part of the community, and looking instead what that community needs rather than the needs of the economy, we can provide this sense of belonging and worth within community. And if we go back to that slide of that Batak weaver weaving for her community, we see there a different way of doing things, in which there really is true belonging and enrichment through the process of creating clothing. So it's also notable that when Jörg Simmel described this dynamic of fashion, what he was really describing was what he saw as Western fashion. He felt that it was the West that had fashion, and that other clothing cultures were not fashion because they didn't change over time. This is plain wrong. They do change over time, but in a slow process based on real meaning. This dominant system of this so-called fashion that he was describing became dominant in the colonial era. Now, stop for a second and just try to imagine colonialism without fashion. And really, it's quite hard to do so. And that is because fashion was a main tool that exhibited the colonial ethos and that of Western superiority. It conceptually and economically cleaved the world in two. And on one side, we have the colonizers, and the other side, the colonized. For the first time in history, there was one single binary, and that is called the colonial difference. And that is what we have here on this slide. On the top slide, we have an image of the colonial administrator, Sir Auckland Colvin, and his family. photographed in 1885. The picture below was just a little bit before, in 1860, an image by Narayan Daji. And here we have this difference, this of what was seen on the top there as an image of civilized people, of people of worth, progression, modernity, and on the other side, that of primitivism and backwardness. We know this is a myth, but it's so pervasive that we rarely even think about it nowadays. And the colonial era saw planned erasures of clothing traditions all over the world, and this is still carrying on today. And notably, we see these images of First Nations people that were sent to residential schools. They entered wearing their Indigenous dress. They left wearing Western styles of dress. Colonialism was a project to enforce civility, so-called civility, and Western morals, in line with a project of economic growth and that of extraction. It was the spread of an ideology through culture. At Fashion Act now, we say that fashion creates, normalizes, and depends on sacrifice zones. We have here in this image 3 examples of fashion sacrifice zones. On the left, that of the Aral Sea that was almost completely irrigated for the sake of growing cotton, leaving behind a wasteland in what was a place in which people fished, had lovely holidays, and had lovely lives. In the middle there, an image of the Citarum River in Indonesia and on the island of Java that is completely been intoxicated by toxic dyes from the garment industry. And on the right there even, we have an image of literal lives being sacrificed, that in the collapse of Rana Plaza. So in Sandra Neeson's, when she describes the sacrifice zones that are specific to fashion, she paints an image of that of degraded land that is sacrificed for the sake of economic growth. I mean, the most visceral examples of those are that which are used, the land that is sacrificed for the sake of mining and oil and gas. So the land gets degraded, and on the land are the peoples that are native to it and also their cultures. So when that land is degraded and they can no longer live on it, they then must move to cities to find jobs. And therefore, the fashion industry potentially gains a workforce, a cheap workforce from those people, but also those people then need to modernize. They leave behind their cultures and their styles of dress that were perhaps once sustainable and within the carrying capacity of the earth, or even regenerative in their production. And so the fashion industry gains both consumers and a workforce. But there's also something else that's notable within the sacrifice zones of fashion, in that for a sacrifice zone to exist, you need to have people who are othered, people that are deemed disposable, their land disposable, and their cultures disposable. And fashion has a price to pay, because it is fashion that helps to create that binary between those that are fashionable, those that are worthy, and those that are not. And so therefore, we see fashion as an injustice, because it is tied to our system of economic growth. Fashion creates the binaries of those that are fashionable and those that are not. And fashion is something that does not enrich us, but feeds on our insecurities. We must now defashion. Thank you, and I'll hand back over to Belle.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I've seen that talk before, and it's always incredibly powerful. This section, part 2, is called Voices from the Pluriverse. And before we go on, I want to define that word, the pluriverse. As you've heard from Sarah, the dominant industrial fashion system that we all know is rooted in colonialism, and it's based on ideas of growth and exploitation at the expense of people, planet, and animals. And Fashion Act now sees no room for this in a sustainable world, in a world that wishes to go forward. Fashion Act now is convinced that this monoverse must be replaced with multiple systems that are smaller in scale, local, fair, sustainable, a clothing pluriverse. And here we take and are inspired strongly by ideas from degrowth from Earth Logic and from David Bollier's Commons. Fashion Act now is convinced that the current monoverse must be replaced with multiple systems. So we invite you now to imagine a world in which there is no central dominant fashion system. What would that look like? What would it feel like? Because we believe very much, as Dutch designer Thomas Lema is quoted as saying, that the next big thing is actually a lot of small things. So in this section, Fashion Act now is presenting 3 voices from a world that is rarely heard in the context of the fashion industry, in its magazines, on its catwalks, and yet Fashion Act now considers these voices indispensable, inspirational. The first voice comes from Indonesia, and I will invite a founding member of Fashion Act now, Sandra Neeson, to introduce the film and afterwards comment on it. And I want to say a little bit about Sandra. Her presence in the group has been absolutely fundamental to our work going forward. She wrote a seminal report called Fashion, Its Sacrifice, Zone and Sustainability in 2020, from which we have continued to draw inspiration. She is an anthropologist and specialist in the clothing and textile traditions of the Batak people of North Sumatra, the image of the woman weaving. She was a Batak woman. Sandra is co-director of this film, and she has taught at universities, has worked in numerous museums around the world. Perceiving the sharp decline in indigenous textile traditions, she joined Fashion Act now to call attention to the harmful cultural and environmental effects of the global industrial fashion system and to work towards dismantling it. She coined the expressions sacrifice zones of fashion and clothing pluriverse. And now I'd like to pass over to Sandra.
Thank you very much, Belle. And good evening, everybody. Such a pleasure to be able to introduce our film for you this evening. It's entitled Uli's Voice, From a Sacrifice Zone of Fashion. It's a film that we worked very hard on before this event. It was made specially by Fashion Act Now for this event, State of Fashion. The star of the film is a Batak weaver named Uli Panggabean. She lives in North Sumatra in Indonesia. I noticed her on Facebook, actually. I've never met her, but she had such incredible depth and clarity of thought that she always amazed me. And when we were going to do films about sacrifice zones and the pluriverse, I thought she was our ideal person, and it turns out that she was. I find her thinking to be very parallel to that of Fashion Act Now, and it unifies the world in that regard. The film was made by MJ Anashir, a Javanese artist, together with his assistant, Agustina Sitanggang. We continue to work as a team in Indonesia in the hope that we can improve the circumstances under which Uli is forced to work. You'll soon see them. The filmer said, her voice is going to generate many more voices and reach many ears until it reaches the top. He worked on this film with deep dedication because he saw its potential and need. After this launch, as Belle has already said, the film will be available on our website, and you can view it as well on the filmer's YouTube canal. And we will now launch right into the film.
Saya berdiri di sini melalui FAN dan teman-teman di seluruh dunia sesama Partonun untuk bersuara lebih keras, mengembalikan semua hak kami atas karya-karya ini. Horas, selamat siang dari Tarutung. Saya Uli, saya lahir di Pancurna Pitu, Silindo. Saya berprofesi sebagai penenun tradisional Batak, khusus untuk tenunan-tenunan Silindo. Saya terlahir dari keluarga penenun. Saya dan seluruh keluarga saya, mulai dari nenek saya, adalah penenun. Kami menekuni tenun ulos, kain untuk ritual adat yang sudah dilakukan nenek moyang kami hingga sekarang. Saya lahir dengan pakaian modern, dengan baju-baju gaun. Saya tidak lagi mengenal pakaian tradisional. Menurut cerita yang kita dengar dari orang-orang tua, mereka memakai pakaian modern itu semenjak adanya berbagai perdagangan lintas dan pendatang-pendatang baru di luar Batak di daerah tersebut. Pakaian menurut modernisasi adalah wujud dari kecerdasan manusia. Saya rasa tidak. Itu tidak betul. Di sini sudah ada kepintaran, kecerdasan, penemuan, pengetahuan. Dan komunitas ini tidak asal dibuat. Saya memandang tenun itu adalah jati diri kami dan juga harga diri kami. Karya-karya itu adalah ciptaan yang diwariskan kepada kami secara darah dan terus-menerus dilestarikan dan dianggap kebanggaan. Harga diri kami itu tidak bisa dinilai dengan uang dan materi yang ditawarkan oleh industri. Bertenun itu adalah panggilan. Saya meneruskan apa yang sudah diwariskan secara turun-temurun ke dalam darah saya. Pilihan tetap bertenun tradisional itu karena saya melihat bahwa itu jauh lebih ramah lingkungan dan penuh dengan ilmu, pengetahuan, dan juga menjadi petualangan. Karena di tradisi kami, di tradisi tenun itu, kami tidak hanya memproduksi kain semata, tapi kami juga menganggapnya spiritual, bagian dari kepuasan rohani, bagian dari kepuasan jiwa. Itu yang tidak ditemukan di kain-kain buatan pabrik. Ini lebih luas cakupannya dari seni. Karena kita juga di dalamnya harus menyertakan alam dan kelestariannya. Karena tenun itu asalnya adalah dari alam, alat-alatnya dari alam, bahan-bahannya dari alam. Jika tenun itu hilang, maka perawatan kepada alam itu akan berkurang. Orang tidak akan punya kebutuhan lagi dengan alam kalau semuanya sudah bisa dihasilkan pabrik. Karena alam tidak bisa ditanggung-jawabi dan dipelihara oleh satu orang. Itu harus kesadaran kolektif. Kami semua adalah komunitas. Komunitas yang terjalin di dalam marga dan adat. Tenun itu adalah komunitas. Bahwa desainnya itu bersama. Pengerjaannya itu bersama. Ilmunya bersama. Karena itu di daerah saya lebih penting dari materi. Kemudian ada orang yang mengubahnya atau ada orang yang serakah mengambilnya untuk dijadikan penghasil uangnya. Demikian caranya. Mereka menitik beratkan setiap karya itu harus menjadi uang. Saya rasa di situ yang membuat pergeseran ini semakin lama, semakin jauh, semakin jauh. Tetapi lama-kelamaan terjadi pergeseran yang dahsyat sekali bahwa kain-kain untuk ritual yang kita sebut ulos itu diproduksi secara massal oleh mesin, oleh alat tenun bukan mesin. Mereka melakukan pencurian motif, pencurian ukuran, pencurian keilmuan yang sudah kami warisi bertahun-tahun lamanya, bahkan ratusan tahun lamanya dan bergenerasi. Ini suatu tindakan semena-mena bagi kami. Mereka yang telah mengambil motif kami ini tidak sadar bahwa mereka melakukan sesuatu yang buruk kepada kami. Sesuatu yang buruk kepada alam. Mereka mungkin tidak sadar. Selama 8 tahun, saya memperjuangkan tenun ini untuk bisa mendapat tempat lagi di masyarakatnya. Orang kami sangat menyukai tradisinya. Tapi mereka bingung dengan sejarahnya. Mereka ingin modern, tapi di satu sisi mereka rindu dengan budayanya. Tapi mereka tidak tahu harus memulai dari mana. Ini juga kebingungan yang pernah saya alami bertahun-tahun. Beberapa partonun memilih berhenti dari pekerjaannya dan menekuni bidang yang lain. Beberapa meneruskan seperti saya, tetapi kami akhirnya berkecimpung dan menjadi bagian industri dari tekstil ini. Kami tidak lagi bertenun sesuai dengan desain yang sudah ditanamkan di kepala kami, tetapi kami bertenun sesuai dengan pesanan dan motif dari desainer. Kami tak lebih dari manusia yang diprogram untuk bertenun. Tak jauh beda dari mesin, tapi kami terpaksa melakukan ini untuk tetap punya nafkah. Nafkah yang sama rendahnya dengan harga produksi mesin atau jauh lebih rendah. Ini semua sebuah sistem. Sistem yang membuat kami tidak berdaya dengan keadaan ini. Saya menginginkan kebebasan dari sistem perdagangan ini. Satu-satunya cara kami terus bertenun adalah mengharapkan benang pabrik. Dan kami dikontrol dari benang-benang itu. Harga kami dikontrol, penjualan kami dikontrol, motif kami dikontrol. Kami menenun sesuai dengan pesanan mereka. Bukan sesuai dengan keahlian kami di sini. Dia adalah guru yang sudah menanamkan ini ke kepala saya tanpa sadar gitu. Tahun 2009 ibu saya berhenti bertenun. Karena meneruskan itu seperti hanya memperkaya orang lain saja. Saya ingin punya kesempatan bersama komunitas saya untuk mengendalikan pemakaian motif-motif kami dan juga peredarannya di adat. Kami juga berharap bahwa ada regulasi untuk para pekerja seperti kami. Kami ingin ditempatkan sebagai partonun dan orang yang memiliki hak cipta dari karya-karya tenun tersebut. Mereka harusnya memproduksi kain yang tidak sama dengan kain kami. Karena jika kami berlomba dengan mesin, kami pasti kalah. Kekuatan manusia berbeda dengan mesin. Saat ini, kain yang saya tenun berlomba dengan mesin, itu tidak manusiawi untuk partonun. Karena itu saya mempunyai harapan yang sangat besar bahwa akan ada perlindungan kepada partonun tentang kain-kain tradisional ini. Dan mereka dikembalikan fungsinya seperti semula. Kami hanya meminta bagian untuk tetap memakai kain-kain tradisional itu kepada ritual saja. Karena tidak mungkin di zaman ini kita mengembalikan orang-orang untuk berpakaian tradisional. Dengan kesadaran seperti ini, maka akan banyak yang kita selamatkan dari tenun. Termasuk alat-alatnya yang banyak. Termasuk pohon-pohonnya, termasuk tumbuhan-tumbuhan yang dipakai untuk memproduksi tenun itu. Itu seharusnya dikembalikan kepada kami seperti dulu. Dan kami seharusnya mendapat perlindungan untuk semua karya-karya dan motif yang sudah kami pelajari sekian tahun. Juga kami harus punya kebebasan untuk berkarya. Semua pakaian-pakaian yang dicetak dengan motif-motif yang telah kami warisi beratus-ratus tahun itu, kami Partonun tidak mendapat manfaat atau royalti dari semua itu. Bahkan kami juga tidak mendapat izin untuk mereka menggunakan karya itu. Saya berdiri di sini melalui FAN dan teman-teman di seluruh dunia sesama Partonun untuk bersuara lebih keras, mengembalikan semua hak kami atas karya-karya ini. Kita semua ini pasti terhubung. Seperti benang-benang kita yang panjang ini, kita pasti terhubung. Ini ada keterhubungan di antara kita semua, di antara alam kita semua. Kita pasti terhubung. Dan sudah waktunya kita sadar keterhubungan kita semua ini. Demikian yang bisa saya sampaikan. Mau lihat Horas.
It's a powerful film, and it has a lot of content. Tonight, I'd like to just comment on one thing. I'm deeply struck by Uli's words at the end of the film, where she urges us to be aware that we are all connected like the warp yarns in her textiles. She speaks to all of us out here in the world, and she appeals to our common humanity. She has a sense of the oneness of the world, and she assumes that there's a universal ethic of caring. She's convinced that if people really knew, they would not allow her and other weavers to suffer oppression and lose their traditions and their connections with nature. She assumes that we are not aware of how difficult we make it for her to continue her weaving tradition. She has faith that if she can only succeed in conveying the value of her tradition, which she deeply loves, we will stand with her. Her belief in our collective goodness moves me. And I wonder if it's shaped by the thought world surrounding her ancient weaving practice. Sarah, could you put up the slide, please, for me? Most of us have been unconsciously shaped by the growth-oriented fashion industry, which divides and blinkers us. Even though the industry has globalized, it splits the world into those with and those without fashion, wealth, and power. We have all become victims of this in one way or another. The $3 trillion fashion industry, that's $3,000 million industry, has a spectacular reach into every corner of the globe, every culture and every system. It involves 60 to 70 million garment workers. It's painful that the fate of these workers is to become financially dependent on precisely the industry that undermines their indigenous cultures. We've already seen this slide. Sarah has shown it to us. The man who benefits the most from the fashion system is the head of LVMH, the largest fashion holding company in the world, situated in Paris. And he was, in 2021, the richest person in the world. And Uli has talked about how the system works against her. She's hurt by that same system that makes him so rich. She represents indigenous makers of clothing everywhere. In fashion, there's a fairness discourse, and it focuses on the circumstances of garment workers. By way of this film, Fan shows the need to expand this discourse to include makers of indigenous clothing. This slide can go away now, thank you. They are also suffering as a consequence of the fashion system. Why are they unseen? It's crucially important to de-erase indigenous systems, to bring them back into view, to honor them, and to ensure they have the room they need to survive. They hold a key to alternatives to the fashion system, and that is precisely what fashion reformers are looking for now. You might counter that the fashion industry is increasingly celebrating artisanal craft, and it is, But surely this film reveals that such recognition reduces indigenous traditions to mere techniques in support of the industry. Treating holistic, complex, independent traditions as sources of techniques is no different than treating them as sources of design that the industry can plunder. It's another insidious form of erasure that may provide some with income, but it does not support the traditional indigenous clothing traditions. Indeed, it expands the reach of the fashion industry. This film offers a small glimpse into how fashion erodes the value of indigenous clothing ideologically, technologically, politically, and economically. It depicts coloniality at work. The disappearance of indigenous worlds is not inevitable. Unlike what many people believe, it is a consequence of advertising, modern education, the power of fashion, the co-optation of governments by capital, and the resultant policies, regulations, and monopolies that operate against any meaningful recognition of cultural diversity. So this film teaches us that the fashion discourse is insufficient when it focuses solely on the industry itself. Fashion is significantly and tragically more than the normalized definition of style change through time, which we may all have learned when we went to fashion studies, at least in my generation. The film shows that the fashion sustainability framework also, with its emphasis on materials, needs to be expanded to include the relationships between people and the natural world. Sustainability isn't just about whether your shirt is made of cotton or synthetic fiber. It's also about whether all of fashion's processes will allow people like Uli to continue to have access to the natural materials she needs to perpetuate her weaving tradition. The grasses in the film that she was looking for are now very hard for her to find because of pesticides and herbicides. Acknowledging the pluriverse of clothing traditions is an endorsement of a decolonial view of dress. The clothing pluriverse includes all of the clothing traditions in the world and throughout time. And when we realize that, then it hits home that indigenous cultures may be fashion's most immense sacrifice zone. So let's go back to that word connectedness. Uli is convinced that connectedness, that consciousness that we're all connected will make the difference. I can scarcely think of an idea more radical, more powerful, or more fundamental. In fact, it echoes ancient Buddhist teachings. It has the power to shift our view of the world and our position in it, to change our definition of fashion and how we study it, to perceive new urgency in fashion fairness. Uli is hanging by a thread. To enable us to see the divide between the global north and the global south for what it is, a colonial illusion that is maintained for the benefit of those with fashion, power, and wealth. Solidarity is caring, and caring is solidarity. We are all Uli, and Uli is us. Uli's last word in the film is horas. This is a Batak word wishing well-being to all. May our clothing systems offer that to her. Back to you, Belle.
Thank you so much, Sandra. I've seen that film with Yuli 4 or 5 times now, and each time I find new inspiration from it. It's so incredibly moving. I'd like to move on to the second voice from the Pluriverse, and to do so, I would like to invite Veronica Pasantes to introduce the film and to offer her reflections on the film from her experience in Latin America. Veronica is another founding member of FAN. She has over 25 years of experience in the fields of education, sustainable fashion, the arts, working in the Andes as an academic and educator and designer. She's worked in various functions in museums and galleries. And she now lives in Miami, where she co-founded the sustainable textile brand, The Onikas. She lectures on sustainability in textiles and has consulted for private and public institutions aiming towards making their platforms more ethical and inclusive. Veronica, would you like to introduce your film?
Thank you, Belle. Just to note, when I first heard Sandra speak about Uli, I was so struck by the similarities between her and Matico, who you will meet soon. Not only their struggle to keep their art alive against the industrial fashion industry, but also the deeper meaning behind their weaving and their deep connection to nature and community. And like Matico, I was also born in Ecuador. And for 20 years, like you've said, I've worked with artisans. And my studies in Latin American colonial art took me to study post-colonial theory. So for years, I had shelved that until the pandemic, when I had more time to research and take a deep dive into sustainability and decolonizing. But I also always felt that there was something missing with the mainstream narrative. I thought it needed to be more expansive and inclusive of the culture and voices of historically marginalized people, the other. I had gotten bored of the panels I was on where I was the only one speaking about cultural heritage and indigenous wisdom. I was looking for a more decolonial anthropological perspective. And then I came across a YouTube with you and Sandra and Sarah, linking these two concepts and addressing the threat of indigenous clothing systems. And for me, that was a big aha moment. And since then, I have been working with Fashion Act Now. So it's quite an honor to be here and to introduce to you this film shot originally by my friend David Olguin from my brand. And we reworked today with Nashir, who did the other film, about Matico or Matilde Lema, a 77-year-old weaver, midwife, and community healer from Peguche, Ecuador. So let's watch the film.
Bueno, mi nombre es Matilde Lema, pero soy conocida como Matico Lema. Tengo 72 años y más. Y soy de la comunidad de Peguche, soy una mujer artesana y siempre les hago conocer lo que es mi trabajo. Y también he pensado mejorar nuestra artesanía, porque con la misma cosa vivir es un poco difícil. Como el mercado artesanal de Pavalo está cansado de la gente, más de estas cosas chinas, cosas de Guatemala también, y también de los peruanos. Entonces yo trabajo desde niña. Primero fue también enfermera auxiliar, que fue importante trabajar en las comunidades para conocer el resto de mi gente, ¿no? Pero después me casé y ya seguí trabajando artesanía. Pero desde niña he trabajado con mis padres de artesanía. El geométrico que ella tiene, el rombo o geométrico, no es para nosotros un geométrico, sino es semilla. El tejido que está medio, que está como que está zafándose, eso es guacho. Guacho es una palabra quichua de cuando nosotros sembramos, dejamos una parte vacío para poner la semilla, el maíz o el alberca, lo que sea. Entonces eso es para nosotros el guacho. Guacho está aquí, esto como vacío, ¿no? Un poco, entonces eso es guacho, esto es semilla. Entonces es importante también hacer conocer lo que es de la cultura que llevamos nosotros tejiendo los tejidos. Eso era importante porque si no hacemos conocer al mundo nuestra artesanía, ¿qué podemos hacer? Y la gente tiene que conocer. Si está trabajando con artesanía, tiene que ser una mujer que quiera trabajar, una mujer que tenga corazón para el resto, para poder ayudar. Entonces, así nosotros podemos pagar un precio justo, porque toda la vida hemos vivido explotados y nunca hemos podido hacer algo, ¿no? Es lindo, ¿no? El trabajo de nosotros que hacemos a la mano es importante. Entonces las mujeres trabajan en su casa, por más que sean madres solteras o separadas, digamos, tienen su casita, sus animales, tienen sus hijos para poder cuidarles, ¿no? Entonces, por eso, cuando es necesario, nosotros nos reunimos aquí. Esta casa ha sido, por eso dicen mis hijos, mamá, si nosotros venimos a descansar, pero aquí no se puede descansar, es como municipio que entra una gente, otra gente. Es así, ¿no? Pero para mí es una alegría. Claro, también es cansado, pero para mí es una alegría porque eso me da esa oportunidad para mi vida tener paz y estar en contacto con la gente.
Sorry about that. I want to give a little context for the film. The region where Matico lives is called Imbabura. It is known for its textile industry in Ecuador. Like Uli, her grandparents and parents were weavers. They taught her how to weave at a young age, and they worked in a colonial textile mill or obraje. At 13, a Peace Corps program took Matico and trained her, didn't take her, they taught her to be an auxiliary nurse and a midwife, a role she still holds today. At 15, this training was interrupted when she was forced to get married against her will to an unfaithful, abusive husband. But she never stopped weaving. And in fact, she supported the family throughout this very abusive marriage. At age 52, she left him and she started her own cooperative called Warmi Maki, which means hand of woman in Quechua, that's the native language. And I've had a pleasure to work with her and her daughter Paula there for the past 7 years. Like Uli, Matico also had many hardships, exclusion, racism, and sexism. As a student at the local convent school, she was hit on the head when she spoke Quechua, like the boarding schools in Canada and the US. She was also ostracized for being divorced. Many women would not let them go to her weaving cooperative because they feared that they would pick up bad habits. And I have to say, as a single divorced woman in the United States, I have also experienced similar microaggressions. Because where she lives has a very high index of abuse. So her house, this community that she made, Warnimaki, that she has nurtured for 2 decades, it really struck a chord with me. It is such a sharp contrast to the US, where the recent ban on abortion have put women at great risk. As opposed to that, the environment that she creates is a lesson in resiliency in the face of adversity. And it's so ironic that the systems and voices that the industrial fashion system erases are the ones that we need to actually listen to. She's a role model for me. She was sustainable before the word got commodified, and she's a beacon of ancestral wisdom. As a healer, she uses native plants to treat everything from depression to COVID, and also she uses it to dye her textiles. I'm excited to tell you guys that recently she's had much notoriety, including this book that was just published about her. So people are waking up in the 8 years that I've worked with her. She's really, which is great for the movement in Ecuador. Her workshop is such a brilliant example of a local, fair, sustainable clothing system. And as you can see from the film, she's always wearing her traditional dress. Now in the Andes, dress has always been a symbol of both resistance and community, from pre-colonial times to the present. According to anthropologist Lynn Michel, who I also worked with, the dress that Otavalo women wear is the closest informed to what women wore during the Inca Empire. Same wrap, same belt, and the wrapping of the hair that they have is pre-Incaic. So it's a very, very long tradition. In the Andes, clothing is still used as resistance and community. In fact, today, if you Google Ecuador, you will see that the indigenous manifestation ceased. But in the past 2 weeks, these protests led by Ecuador's more than 1 million indigenous population, and you see at the forefront of the demonstrations, you'll see indigenous people still wearing the same traditional dress that they did years ago. Not all of them, but many of them, especially the leaders. There's an Ecuadorian Guarani Amazonian leader, a climate activist named, I'm going to butcher the name, Nemonte Nenquimo, who was on the cover of Time magazine. She received the Goldman Environmental Prize in 2020. And you will see, if you look at that she's wearing her native headdress, and she's also wearing the traditional paint on her face. To me, this is a really incredible example of how these clothing systems are not frozen in time, but they're very much active, performative, and a symbol of community. And that's why I think this work that we're doing right now, supporting the Pluriverse, is so important. And even though fashion activism seems like a Western phenomenon, according to scholars like Homi Bhabha, which I studied with, I'm going to quote him. He said, "Clothes are used to negotiate and resist occupation or colonial forces of assimilation as a form of hybridity." So in this manner, colonial dress challenges the formation, the colonial formation of loyal subjects, just like speaking indigenous languages also is a form of colonial resistance. And this concept of hybridity is very important in the Andes, because even though I'm speaking of her traditional dress, it's not a traditional dress per se, because it is also a hybrid of Spanish, pre-Incaic and Incaic. The Spanish actually introduced the tools of production. What we saw, the treadle loom, the carter, the spinning wheels, all Spanish introductions. The fibers, wool and silk also. So basically, this is just to further Sandra's work and claim that colonialism is everywhere. And that in order to really expand the definition of sustainability, we must acknowledge that fashion is the biggest of all colonial creations. But back to the Andes. Since the second millennium of BC, textiles are pivotal to this region. They basically encode, as you heard her explain, their whole cosmology in the textiles. I'm wearing one of them. And the Andes had no written language, unlike the Maya, and the textiles were the primary form of communication. Textiles were not a representation of language, but a means of communicating in and of themselves. So in the Andes, clothing carried and carries a symbolic weight that conveys cultural and political messages. Clothing is very effective in communicating because it does so visually in a way that language does not. And lastly, I'm going to end with community, which is another beautiful link that Uli has with Matico. In the film, she speaks of her space as one of community and healing, the very opposite of the monolithic fashion system. Matico, to me, is regenerative slow fashion at its best. So I'm going to end with a couple quotes from her. One where you saw in the film, she says, "We work with single mothers. They work at home so they can take care of their children and animals. But we meet here. This house, Warmi Maki, is a refuge. It's like a municipality where people are always coming in and out. It is a lot of work, very tiring, but for me, it brings me joy because it gives me the opportunity to have peace and be in contact with my community. At Warmi Maki, no woman ever works for free. Even if I am penniless, women must get paid." I love that. And at the very end of the film, you hear her speak about the depth of meaning behind her textiles. She speaks, and I think when she speaks, and I'm going to quote her again, she's really getting at the intersectionality of Andean textiles, which is this weaving of the spiritual and earthly realm, and it's a place where agriculture, craft, weaving, and stories are one. So I'm going to paraphrase her describing this poncho that I'm wearing. So in the film, or when she was talking to me, she said, for instance, the pattern and design of what you're wearing is my father's design. You're wearing a poncho that features the semilla, the seed pattern, and the chaquiñan. In Quechua, that means small path. This geometric pattern, the rhombus, which you can see here, for us is not a geometric shape. It signifies the seed. Guacho is a Quechua word that describes the part of the process of planting seeds. It's the seed pattern that reflects our culture. The patterns woven into the textiles are important because if we don't educate the world about the meaning behind our artisan production, it will be lost. People need to understand our culture, the one inscribed in the textiles. It is beautiful, our labor. It is important. Thank you.
Thank you, Veronica, for sharing Matico's story. and the burdens she's had to bear, also for reminding us that cloth can be a connection between the spiritual and the earthly, and it can be this incredible symbol of resistance, which I find really wonderful. So thank you for that. Our last voice from the Pluriverse comes from the UK, so very much closer to home for some of us, not all of us tonight. And our next speaker is Susan Dye. So Susan and her husband, Ashley Walker, have a small but productive dye garden near London, which Susan will be telling us more about, where they've been growing and using Northern European dye plants for more than 15 years. Their wonderful website on dye plant horticulture is called Nature's Rainbow, and their blog provides a wealth of information on dye plant horticulture. And Susan is particularly interested in the red dyes in madder and related plants, and I'm sure she'll explain what those are in her talk. Ashley is very good at growing and dyeing with woad and Japanese indigo for blues. Both left traditional work about 20 years ago, and Ashley became a horticultural therapist using gardening to promote healing and well-being. They also help people to create attractive dye gardens, which give great colors in the dye pot, but also enhance wildlife and biodiversity in their area. Ashley and Susan believe that growing your own color profoundly changes your relationship to textiles and goes a little way towards changing consumption habits for the better. And now I'd like to pass over to Susan to hear more about this extraordinary work. Thanks, Susan.
Thank you very much, Belle. Thank you for the introduction, and it's a real pleasure to be here. Sarah is going to put a slide up for me. Thank you, Sarah. I think that's the last slide, Sarah. We just whoosh backwards through. Brilliant. Thank you very much. So yeah, my name is Susan. My surname is quite amusing because although it describes what I do, I was born with that name and had no intention or knowledge of dyeing when I lived half of my life with that name. So it's very, very interesting. So first thing I would say is that when Fashion Act Now, that's Sarah, and then Sandra asked me to contribute to this session in this amazing conference, I was absolutely certain that they needed someone else, not me. I was certain they needed someone much more qualified, an expert weaver, or at least someone with a very active interest in fashion. But as conversation with these two amazing women unfolded, I got completely drawn in, and I agreed to watch Uli's film, and perhaps as you can understand, that drew me in even further. And for the last 3 weeks, I would say my entire world has been shaken up and turned around. I've been reflecting deeply and constantly on my relationship to my dye plants and to the dyeing that I do, and the context of that with activism, and in particular fashion activism. So firstly, some background about me. Next slide, please, Sarah. I'm 58. I'm married to Ashley. We have no kids. I live a really simple life compared to many people around me. I live in Hitchin in Hertfordshire. That's about 30 miles north of London. And on the left at the top, that's our little house on the end in pale green. We're the last house in the street with a front garden with plants in it, sadly. And we live on a very low income compared to most people around us. We've been in the same house for 30 years and lived all that time without a car by choice. And for the last 20 years, I've neither been in an aeroplane nor by choice had a television. In fact, I've only flown 5 times in my life. So I say this because I want to emphasize, on the whole, I really don't travel very far. Neither of us go very far. Ashley and I have gradually, as Belle said, withdrawn from traditional work. Next slide, please, Sarah. I've been in and out of environmental activism, though, for the most of my adult life, and particularly climate activism, all sorts of transport campaigning. But over the last 7 years, I would say I've been mostly avoiding active campaigning, partly because of a confusion, a real genuine confusion about how best to live at this moment in history. And I have to say, I do live with a fairly constant sense of despair. Next slide, please. But nonetheless, with my husband, we grow dye plants on 2 allotments. Now, for those of you in the States, this is like a community garden. We rent these little pieces of land from the local council. They're each about 5 meters by 5 meters. So if I've got my maths right, that's about 500 square feet in total. And all of this started about 15 years ago because Ashley wanted to explore using dye plants in his work as a horticultural therapist, where he was using plants and gardening as a way of helping people recover from mental ill health and other things. So one day he came home from work with a freshly shorn sheep's fleece, gave it to me and said, "Can you work out what we do with this?" Because his dye plants were ready and he wanted us to start using it and applying it to this fleece. Well, I'd never seen anything like this before in my life. I completely fell in love with it. The smell, the texture, the bounciness. And then I learned how to wash it and then how to dye it with our plants. Then I learned how to spin and eventually started crocheting my first yarn into a large blanket over the space of a couple of years. That's what's behind me tonight. Well, most of the practical skills I needed to do this, I learned through the network of guilds of spinners, weavers and dyers, or I should say weavers, spinners and dyers. The weavers come first. These networks are absolutely great in the UK. There are a few outside the UK as well. And I know that in the States you have Hand Weavers America. I'm sure that there are other networks everywhere. So not many people know about them though. And in the UK, these groups were entirely funded by their members. They began in the mid-20th century, were continuing the work of an amazing woman weaver called Ethel Merray. She, in her turn, was carrying on the campaign, if you like, of William Morris and his compatriots who were aiming to revive and protect traditional hand textile crafts against the forces of machine production. And I would say anybody listening who wants to get a taste of real making, I mean, we saw in the films just the magic of the cloth being evolving out of the hands of the weavers and the yarn being spun in the hands of the spinners. I adored those pictures. I recommend all of you try and find a local group that does this wherever you are in the world and just get a little taste in your own hands of what that's like. So although I'm not a weaver, I do know through connection to this community enough about weaving to be absolutely awed, blown away by watching Uli making her traditional cloth. Not just the cloth's complexity and beauty, but also the way that the ulos, the traditional cloth, travels with you from cradle to grave. And it's important in ritual. A cloth with this depth of meaning, surely there are very few contemporary textiles in my culture, in the global north, that could ever carry that. Next slide, please. Thanks, Sarah. Another point of connection with Uli's film is I was born and grew up in Norwich. This is a city in East Anglia. We call it the bum end of Britain. It's the bit that sticks out into the North Sea. And Norwich as a city was famous for hundreds of years for its very high quality of weaving and dyeing. But the Industrial Revolution destroyed the hand weaver's trade, and everything was gone, well gone, by the time that my grandmother was a little girl. In the final 50 years or so, when it was still a successful trade from about 1820 to 1870, the trade survived by elaborating, perhaps I should more accurately say stealing, designs taken from Mughal shawls from northern India, which the Empress Josephine transformed into a fashion item of unimaginable desire and value. The weavers worked mostly from home in similar conditions to those Uli describes. The designs were tightly prescribed and the wages were eventually very low for the skilled work involved. Now, no one taught me this history when I was a child growing up in Norwich, which makes me very sad. I only discovered it in 2013 when I was studying for a patchwork and quilting course. This, the next slide, is the quilted wall hanging that emerged in response to this history. So the next slide should have the blues and greys at the bottom represent the weavers working in their homes. The red in the middle is a woolen madder dyed with my own dye river, because the river of the city was important and would run red when they emptied the dye vats. And at the top is my response to the beautiful designs of the woven shawls. I have to say the Norwich weavers were quite formidable actually, and often protested against mechanization and poor pay. The next slide. In the background here, you can see my dye plants I've applied to different linens and cottons and hemp. These plants give me great meaning, and particularly I get meaning from sharing my knowledge about them. And I've found an entire community through the website in particular and the blog that we have that I'd never imagined. It's important for me that I'm growing the same plants that people in Europe used for thousands and thousands of years, and learning how to make the most efficient use of these dyes carried in the plants is very significant. Also, I'm concerned about waste. When you grow a plant from seed, and Matico talking about the profound importance of seed, when you grow a plant from seed, you've put a big investment into it when it's a dye crop, and you want to respect it and make the most of the color that it gives you. Although I have no connection to a local textile tradition like Uli's, and I think there are very, very few unbroken connections in the UK left, when I do pick up a drop spindle, I feel as if I'm traveling back in time, as my hands and body fall into the ancient rhythm while the fiber turns to thread. It's just a beautiful thing to do. I absolutely love teaching others, if you could move to the next slide, Sarah, how to grow and use dye plants. We only teach very small numbers of people in any given year in workshops. This is because we only use what we can grow on our small piece of land. We also sell some seeds, which we save, that brings in a little money, but the satisfaction of having the time to help a student doing their PhD in one of these unusual plants, or encourage a new dye farmer to work at a bigger scale, for me, that's beyond price. Just the same as wearing something that you've made from raw fiber and dyed with your own homegrown plants. Nobody can put a price on that. Where I live in the south of England, I'm personally not very keen on foraging for dye plants because the ecosystems around me are so vulnerable already. I have a friend who's now in her 70s, and she remembers when she used to, as a child, walk out of the town where we live, the hedgerows, the edges of the streets, the little roads would be full of orchids and harebells, and there would be clouds of butterflies in the summer. And it's not like that now. So I would suggest that if people do have the privilege of having some access to land, they grow plants, they put something back for nature. And many of the best dye plants are also absolutely excellent for insects. And growing your own plants, like foraging, gives you a really close sense of the seasons and the way the climate is changing. And for me and Ashley now, our dye garden is as important as a little mini nature reserve as it is a place of producing dyes. So to return to the massive damage the fashion industry does, the traditional capital F fashion industry, I think constraints are really helpful. So in our case, downshifting to live on less income not only has made us more time rich, but it's become really easy to stop ever again thinking about buying clothes needlessly. We're all concerned that it's easy for designers to think that they're healing the fashion industry by replacing one input, synthetic dyes, with another, natural dyes. Yet I don't think this is going to change much. The amount of plant material you need to dye cloth is really significant, and you really have to do it yourself to appreciate that. We don't have enough land to replace the synthetic dyes that we currently use in this way. So either color is going to become a luxury, as perhaps it once was, or we have to dramatically reduce our consumption, maybe reducing just the number of clothes that we have, but also maybe the intensity of the color in them. Even if we bioengineer natural dyes in big vats with genetic engineering, the feedstock still has to come from somewhere. And I bet that's going to be some sort of form of starch or maize or sugar. What does regenerative really mean in terms of natural dyes? Even at our small scale, we're reliant on soil improvers like commercial compost or bought-in manure, as we just don't have enough green waste material to make enough compost of our own. So how can we gather more? How could I be genuinely regenerative? And I have been thinking a lot about this, and thank you for being invited into this. I'm now thinking, do I need to get involved in a community composting project where people could donate their food waste and get something dyed in return, some plant dyes or something? That could be a lot of fun. And Ash and I also want to see a lot more respect for the traditional colour fast dyes. They are more efficient because of the density of dye in the plant, but also the way the plants are really easy to grow and harvest and store. These plants, and Belle mentioned some of them, but you can read about them on my website, the madder for red, the woad for blue, and weld for yellow. These are, after all, the very wise choices of dyers across thousands and thousands of years. There's no harm in playful explorations with any plant you happen to have to hand, but for more serious quantities, isn't it really worth dyeing once and dyeing well? So we really want, as our final demand, that just to invite people to think about slowing down, staying put, stop shopping, and start making both craft items and making community. Thank you. Back to Belle.
Thank you, Susan. Madder and woad, they're such medieval terms. So I would really like to say thank you to all the voices in this section, Yuli, Matico, Veronica, Sandra and Susan and Ashley, all incredibly unique. But I think also what struck us was their commonalities, and I want to speak a little bit about them in a second. I would say that the voices from the Pluriverse that we have highlighted come from Indonesia, Ecuador, and the UK. But voices from the Pluriverse exist across the world, even in places that may seem subsumed in the industrial fashion system. We'll have pockets of this kind of work, all involved in comparable tasks, all interested in perpetuating local traditions, all working intimately with local physical environments, operating within their respective communities. And just before I want to go to the next part, I want to think about some of the themes that have come out, what we call the commonalities. And I'd like to talk about them in the next part as well. I was really fascinated in all three makers' use of imagery, what they chose to express in their work. I was really fascinated by this very, very strong sense of history that each maker demonstrated. Really, that incredible sense of belonging and rootedness in their culture, and how that expressed itself in their practice. I was also really thrilled by the meditative quality of the work, which you won't get in a fast fashion industrial factory. This slowing down, this downshifting, this connection through the hands, this tactility. Very much so also in all three voices was this idea of activism, the rebellious potential of the indigenous practice, or the small scale practice, or the community practice. Another theme I'd like to think about going forward is the deep connection to nature. These aren't makers who buy ready-made cloth. They would avoid that if they can. They tend to make their own, and what that means for their awareness of the natural processes that creates the fibres. And of course, it sounded like a bell throughout all three talks, this idea of community, of people, of connection. It's absolutely fundamental. And so in this section, we're going to work in a couple of ways. We would very much like to open the floor to the audience who are with us tonight to hear about your experiences of perhaps being a voice in the Pluriverse. I know for a fact, actually, from my screen, I can see some people who could speak to that. I won't force you to, but I'd love you to. So any reflections would be great. Any sharings would be great. I'll quickly check my phone to make sure the WhatsApp chat, anything's come through. But also, I'd also like to invite tonight's speakers to sort of respond to some questions that we have for them talking about these issues. So if I could ask tonight's speakers to turn on their cameras, and I can open up these questions to you. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Veronica. And Jennifer, I was so hoping to hear your voice. And of course, Sandra and Malu. That's great to have you here. So the linchpin to tonight's talk is defashion, and we've had discussions. Is this a verb or is this a noun? Does one defashion, or is it one in a state of defashion? And we're still working with this, but I'd love to hear actually from some of the fan members what that term means to them, how it's used, because it could be that defashion is actually the verb that takes us to the post-fashion with a capital F word. Can I get any reflections from anyone about the word defashion? And does Yuli's, Matico and Susan's work represent what we're thinking of as defashion? Sandra.
Yeah, I'd love to weigh in on defashion because, I find it such a handy term. We're all talking about things like, sustainability, decolonization in fashion. What are we going to do with the fashion system? How does it have to change to accommodate the incredible pressures on our world right now, and so on and so on and so on. And I think with defashion, we have this term that bundles it all together. Finally, we needed a word that would combine all of these elements to convey the breadth and the detail of what's needed as we move forward into the future. So it's kind of like that handy basket where you can throw all these terms in that of the kind of transformation that we need to have to move forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I love its linkages to the word degrowth from which it emerged. Did anyone else have any reflections on this idea or this concept? Karishma, thank you.
Morning, everyone. On the topic of defashion and listening to the speakers of the Pluriverse, I resonate very, very, very deeply with it. And for me, much of what has been said and the concept of bringing this pot almost of all of these ideas is really for us to remember. So for me, defashioning is about remembering, and it's about remembering the ways of being, of the multiple beings of the world. And when I mean the beings of the world, that includes the plants, which traditionally in English is referred to as, a thing, and it's a noun, and so therefore it's not alive. Yes. But for me, that is the crux of our disconnection. Yes. Is putting something as a noun, and so it's a thing. Yes. So I listened and listened to the artisans and listened to Uli, and just I had tears in my eyes actually. Yes. Because I have spent a large part of my time in these villages working with multiple weavers and artisans as well, and it just for me brings that this is a pot. And it's like a big pot of all our wisdoms coming yes. in together and creating some connection and hopefully some remembrance and yes. some new learnings, which are actually our old learnings. So thank you for the term.
Oh, Karishma, I wanted to find out a little bit more about you, actually, for those of us who don't know you. You said you work in some of the villages.
I have. Well, now I am in Aotearoa in New Zealand, mm-hmm. And I'm working in rewilding our education system. So my defashioning is termed as rewilding our mm-hmm. education system by creating frameworks. And it's really crazy because I'm not really creating them. I'm kind of just challenging our current systems to remember them and bringing them forward into mainstream education. So my work is, from a Western perspective, I guess, rooted in earth logic and post-growth. But my history and my life has been a path of living in the old ways, the old African and Hindu ways, because I was raised in a rural part of South Africa during the apartheid regime. With people and family and community that lived completely in unison with the land and the earth. And that was in everyday practice to the careers that we now have today. So that's just a summary. So my work has taken me to artisans in Africa and India, Southeast Asia. And I've spent many, many years actually in these various parts of the world with mostly women, but not always women.
When I'm listening to you speak, I'm really fascinated by the use of the words old and new, but actually it's not as simple as that at all. And I love that. The old actually represents a way of deeper connection with nature that was less destructive and more in tune with our earthly environment and more protective of it. I've had
living interconnection, just living in, you couldn't separate it,
No.
You planted corn because it was the season to plant corn, and your menu and the parties and the things you made were around corn because that's the season. So
Yeah.
just you lived that way. So it wasn't separate, it wasn't special.
Yes, yes.
Until later on.
Yeah, well, it's the idea of also challenging the idea of human supremacy, isn't it? Where we're supposed to be better than everything else, and it's just patently becoming obvious that we're really not. If anything else, we're probably a bit worse. I've had an offer from Jennifer, which I'm so delighted to receive, and Jennifer wants to talk about Defashion community and the spiritual, which I think is a wonderful thing to bring into the event tonight. So Jennifer, I'd love to hear. It's great to see you.
Yeah, it is lovely to see you. I mean, those videos were so deeply powerful because just listening to Yuli, you could hear and empathize with her pain. And one point, her pain, but also her determination to transcend the system that is oppressing not only her and her place in her community and her universe, and that is sacrosanct, but also what she brings from her heritage of the past. And so I'm fascinated by spirituality, and Sandra and Yuli and in the other films, and you brought up, Belle, and also you, Karishma, spirituality in the sense of consciousness about interdependency, interconnectedness with others, with nature, being the oxygen that actually fuels community, gives the resilience that then allows communities, be they indigenous or be they more protagonists of the Western sort of fashion industrial complex, to attribute value to things that are true. And it is a truism that we are connected to the earth that we walk on, the plants around us that we depend on, and we should acknowledge the affinity and the caring. So one of the poignant things you said, Sandra, was just Yuli assumes she has a belief in our collective goodness. So I would, and that really, that there is a universal ethic of caring. So underpinning the displacement of this fashion, industrial complex fashion system, I think we have to get to a place, not of homogenous consciousness of spirituality, but a pluriverse of spiritual values underpinning the very fact that no human being is supreme, superior, better than. I come from a land which has, a continent which has suffered greatly under an immense devaluing of the human being of African origin, and so many, this is the reality of supremacy, and so it just rings so true to me, and it's so poignant to hear artisans, craftspeople who carry with them something so precious being devalued by systems that have no right. We should, as part of the spiritual awakening, have an indignation about it that causes even those who have the power and the wealth to agitate against it. But that was a little bit of a diatribe, but it's very raw, and I work with women in Rwanda who in all honesty, outside of the work that I do with them, what they do in terms of sisal weaving is it's so extraordinary. It's so beautiful. It's so intricate. It boggles my mind that by the fashion industrial system is complicit in this idea that what they produce cannot therefore have value because it devalues them and their craft. It boggles my mind, because even if you look at it objectively, tens of thousands of stitches, and this, it's just extraordinary how we've turned value attribution upside down. Yeah. And I think spiritual consciousness is a very important part in the mix of how we can, and obviously with diversity in what spiritual context consciousness is, a pluriverse of that awakening. But I think it's very important because we're so far ahead on a track which is going to ultimately, unless we turn around, kill us as a species and everything else around us.
Jennifer, thank you. You've reminded me that in the awakening comes very deep feelings of grief and outrage. And I think a question has come up in the chat, and it's a response to that grief and outrage. It's really, what do we do now? This is the question that we all ask all the time. Climate justice movements, social justice movements, animal justice movements, what can we do? And so this question is, I'll read it out. Do you feel that this is a citizen movement, and through activism pressure will continue to be put on governments and industry? I'm not sure about the phrasing there. I'm thinking particularly fashion industry. Or is there a way of opening up direct conversations with those such as LVMH to make them change? So do you feel this is a citizen movement? This is such a complex, if there was an easy answer to this, we'd have done it by now. But I would love any reflections on that question that any of the speakers or people with their screens on could offer.
Obviously,
hello, yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
I obviously don't have the answer to this.
Yes,
yes, my name is Malu. I come representing Fibreshed Ireland. And this is a question that we ask ourselves within our own Fibreshed in Ireland and within the greater Fibreshed community. And I think the easy answer is it has to come both ways. It has to come maybe not just in the big scale from the industrial fashion people, because maybe they're not even thinking about this. They're still thinking about growth, profit. But we see a lot of designers, at least here in Ireland. And I'm originally Mexican, so I have that context as well in Mexico. Designers really wanting to do the right thing, really wanting to engage with their materials, engage with the people that create. But there is that disconnect. There's no link. And then we have organizations and NGOs and people like us from the ground up trying to. So I think it has to come from both, from any side. And that's I guess the best answer I can give to a question that seems to have no answer or no easy answer, at least.
No easy answer, I think, is probably, and I absolutely say both sides, but actually there's also multiple sides. It comes from someone once said which approach works, and I said all approaches need to be implemented now. Sandra, I know you have your hand up and you're on mute.
Thank you, Belle. Yes, it's such a wonderful question, and I'm also thinking of Jennifer's words. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for what you said, and also the emotion within. I mean, I could tell you felt it. I'm increasingly getting a sense that even though I've grown up in the Western world and thinking, superiority and all of that you're born with, being a white person, I'm increasingly thinking that and it makes sense that this whole industrial revolution until now and this whole colonial, this is a blip. This is actually a very small blip in the history of the world. And that goodness that I sense in Uli, her absolute belief that if in this universal kindness, if it's awakened, I'm thinking that that is the norm. That, and then when you meet it, it resounds so much within you. It feels like a truth. And actually that brings me to Susan, because you said that your husband works with therapy. Please explain. I'm curious what you would say to this, because you have moved away from this dominant culture, even though you live in the very center of it, 30 miles away from England, from London, and you've chosen a different lifestyle. Your husband is working on therapy related to these plants, and there must be a wealth there that you would like to share more than you have had the chance already.
Thank you, Son. Yeah, thank you. I've been listening, and I'm very, very moved as well by Jennifer's emotion. I was in tears when I first watched Uli's film as well. I think it's profound, and I found it very difficult to read the subtitles and watch what was happening. I needed to watch it 2 or 3 times, so I would implore other people to do that too. Sandra, in response to the question, I am still puzzling about exactly how Ashley and I have ended up where we've ended up. And we have a lot of uncertainty for what happens in the future. And I think I've surrendered to that uncertainty, actually. I'm much trying to concentrate on just being in the now with its ups and downs. When I mentioned in the brief talk that when I touched that sheep's fleece, I experienced something. I fell in love with this smelly, sweaty, greasy lump of something I'd never touched before. And I really did. There is really something primal about being in contact with what would have been the raw material for the clothing for your native area. And it had been shorn in about June, or maybe I got hold of it in July, and I had to find out what to do with it. And it was at that point I reached out and found a connection to this local group. And the woman that I was told to phone was a grand matriarch of the local spinners, weavers and dyers community. I didn't know this at the time, but Daisy May, she was called. And she said, right, sit down, get a pen and paper. I will tell you everything you need to know. And I had this very long conversation, and she told me exactly what I had to do with this sheep's fleece. And I felt like I was just, a whole new door had opened into another realm. I had no idea this was going to happen to me. And she said, and you must come in September to the group and show us what you've done with it. And of course, from that, I had to. There was no question. I had to do it. So she was already in love with this whole process. She knew that I had just been enchanted by it. And I didn't look back. And the generosity and connection of that group was phenomenal. And all these groups where you sit down in a circle and you spin yarn. And I cannot say how profound that is. It's like being in a women's drumming circle, which I've also done for a few years. It is, you do not need to be told very much to sit down and drop into it. So I think it is healing in its core, really. Ashley loves color, and as a child always wanted to make color, and had lots of false starts and frustrations with that. And as an adult, when he had finally got into this job where he was working with plants as a healing medium, which is slowly being recognized as a therapeutic practice, he was really keen to grow dye plants. So I think it is magical. It is enchanting. You know, you pick a plant and then suddenly you have a colored substance. And I just love doing it, and I love sharing it. So there's a professor in, I think it's the University of Southern Australia, Susan Luckman. I've written about her on my blog under the title, Why Do We Do Craft? And she talks about the enchantment of the handmade, and that it does go right into you. And I think designing is one thing, but actually making is another, and they need to be united.
Thank you so much, Susan. I've got Bella, who I know is another dyer, grower and dyer, who is the author of a book called Grow, Cook, Dye, Wear, and I was lucky enough to. Bella, would you like to turn your camera on, or would you just like to go to voices? And then after Bella, I've actually got 2 questions which I'd like to raise in this chat before we have 7 minutes. And just before I let Bella talk, I will just say that there is a handout that will go with this event, which is available in the live stream chat. Bella, I'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. It's nice to see you.
Yeah, it's been a wonderful event and a wonderful discussion. So thank you for everyone involved, and just learned so much and been very inspired. I'm addressing the question that came from the floor in terms of industry, and I'm actually very interested in the role of government. I've just been invited to contribute. The past 2 days, there was a local government association conference in Harrogate that the concept was levelling up and the future of cities. This is a global forum that we're in. So in the UK, there's a big discussion recently about how we address inequalities. And I've been asked to contribute an essay about the future of cities through fashion. And I think local governments, and I'm aware of the structure in the UK because that's where I live, but it might apply to where everyone is in the world, can actually have a real impact in tackling the climate crisis and the way that we live in our local communities. And I felt like there was a lot of interest in thinking of reimagining our high streets, of the way that the allowances the local government could give. And I feel like this recent change of attitudes in lawmakers, because fashion was considered to be a really frivolous thing until recently, that in a sense, lawmakers were in a way almost fearing to deal with and to approach, because it would make them look, well, frivolous. And I think that all of us, our stories, if we can approach really politicians, but in a very local level, and try to create collaborations, there is going to be a big month-long sustainability and cost of living joint event in my community in Walthamstow soon, that has been initiated by my Member of Parliament, Stella Creasy, but also with the local council. And that is going to be something that is really open to the community and very accessible, and would offer a lot of classes. I'm going to do a dye workshop there with food waste, because that is, I grow things as well, but I try to use as much as I can things that we could use for food, because I kind of found that making that link is my contribution to things. But something that is to find a way with our kind of local government to facilitate something that is open to the audience. And then we have this thing that perhaps in that route could influence industry, because I think in my recent conversation with you, Belle, the system that we live in, capitalism, is just possibly the worst system that for us to tackle the climate crisis. But the one thing that we have with capitalism is that if consumers ask for it, capitalism would listen, because that's what capitalism is led by. And there is been a recent shift. There's been a big shift, but it feels like big companies and big players, not necessarily LVMH that was referred to, but big companies feel like they can address it through greenwashing. But if we are informed and we have this connection, what Susan explained about growing things from the land and all these kind of different perspectives that enriches our experience of what it is to grow, then it gives people a much more kind of informed but emotional kind of connection to it, and dare them to ask for more. So that's my contribution.
Thank you, Bella. So we've only got 2 minutes left in this section. So what I would like to do is actually read out the 2 questions that came through, because I think they are key to even listen to. The first one is obviously inspired by the audience here today, but also Matico's extraordinary story. Thank you, Veronica, for bringing it here tonight. The question was, I've noticed there are a lot of female thought leaders in this conference, in this space. What is the role of female rights and feminism in defashioning? I will give you 2 words, absolutely key. I really actually believe that women are the drivers of change. I'm sorry if there are any men listening, but I'm not seeing them here tonight. And there's something about the female worldview that can, you know, is just extraordinary. The second question is, I appreciate the movement and the need to radically shift consumption globally. I work in the industry in the circularity space. The industry is enormous and entrenched. Can you speak to specific strategies that acknowledge radical disparity in size and power? There are change makers out there trying to do exactly that. There are behavior strategists trying to do exactly that. Some of them speaking to exactly this industry. There is no one on this chat tonight who is not aware of that disparity of power. We all have a personal and professional responsibility to speak to the emergency. You know, we are aware. And if you're part of Extinction Rebellion, their answer will be you take to the streets, and civil disobedience is the only option forward because everything else has failed. If that's not within your remit, you become a truth teller within your agency. You know, there are people coming out of Shell saying, I'm not going to work for this organization anymore. You stand up where you can, and you resist where you can, and where you are able to. And with that thought, rounding up this section, I'll go into the last section, which is to reintroduce Sarah and Fashion Act Now's theory of change, in which we try and envisage how we get to this place we need to get to in the spirit of emergency, in this ecological disaster, in a period of mass extinction. And so I'll invite Sarah to rejoin us. Hi, Sarah.
No, thank you, Belle. So for the last bit of this event, I'm just going to go through a whistle-stop tour of Fashion Act Now's vision and theory of change to really kind of round everything up and conclude it. So our vision is of a post-fashion world, that of flourishing, resilient communities and clothing systems that repair the health of us and our planet. We believe that this must be rooted in degrowth. Growth is the root of the problem. And this here is a definition of degrowth. I mean, quite a technical definition of degrowth, a typical definition of degrowth, and by Jason Hickel. And he says that degrowth is a planned reduction of energy and resource use, designed to bring the economy back into balance with the living world in a way that reduces inequality and improves human well-being. But what we've talked about today, and really shown through these stories of the Pluriverse, is that degrowth is so much more than that. We need to get to the roots of this growth problem, and that comes through decolonization and de-enclosure. Jason Hickel also says that degrowth begins as a process of taking less, but in the end, it opens up whole vistas of possibility. It moves us from scarcity to abundance, from extraction to regeneration, from dominion to reciprocity, and from loneliness and separation to connection with a world that is fizzing with life. He goes on to say that degrowth stands for decolonization of both lands and peoples and even our minds. It stands for de-enclosure of the commons, the decommodification of public goods, the de-intensification of work and life. It stands for the de-thingification of humans and nature and the de-escalation of the ecological crisis. At Fashion Act Now, we are believers that the commons is the way that things need to be done. And some of you may be wondering what really is a commons. And a commons arises when a community decides that the resources that they have, be those knowledge or land or whatever else, those resources are not resources to be exploited, but are resources that are a common wealth, are a shared wealth between that community. And they work in and work out how are they going to look after those resources rather than exploit them. So as David Bollier says in his newest book, The Commoner's Catalogue for Changemaking, The commons is a shared system, a system of shared intention designed to steward collective care wealth in fair and collaborative ways, really a kind of form of direct democracy. The commons is a socially coherent group of peers managing collective resources with minimal reliance on the market and state. And that brings us back to that question, does the change happen in industry or the market or the people? And this idea of the commons is really saying that we as people are capable of managing our resources and actually to do so with minimal reliance on the market and state ensures that we do not extract, but actually work in regenerative ways, as Indigenous peoples show all over the world. The commons are bottom-up initiatives that prioritize meeting people's needs over market exchange and capital accumulation. So at Fashion Act Now, we believe that this defashioning process must happen this decade. And firstly, it starts with dismantling the fashion system. We must dismantle the globalized fashion system that prioritizes trade and profits and advertises based on this myth that fashion is civility, culture, relevancy, and worth. We need to dismantle the globalized lengthy supply chains in favor of localization, and we need to eradicate these ideas, the idea of a sacrifice zone, that of people, places, and cultures and ecosystems that are disposable, deemed disposable and exploitable. But we also need to build this new world. We need to nurture the post-fashion commons. Fan wants a thriving pluriverse of clothing cultures, a diversity of independent local clothing systems, all equally respected, free from this dominant globalized fashion industry, this monolithic monoculture. We want clothing that is created in the community for the community, sharing and nurturing humanity's abundant knowledge, skills, culture, creativity, and resources. And it goes without saying, really, that we want regenerative production systems that repair the earth and care for plants, peoples, and animals living in it. But we also want this change to resonate, to radiate out from fashion into other areas. We want to embed this change in culture and economy. And we feel that we can use fashion to experiment with new economies. We use the creativity in fashion to experiment and in ways that we can aim for sufficiency and well-being and create links with a federation of the commons, such as in food and housing, and create blueprints that can be emulated in sectors far beyond clothing. On our website, we've got a declaration that you can make, a pledge that you can make that really sums up everything that we've said here today. So you can head to www.fashionactnow.org if you wish to sign that and be part of the movement. We've also just started a new project, the Common Market. The Common Market is a place, we call it a marketplace, but really it's not a marketplace at all because nothing will be for sale. This is a marketplace that is all about participation. It is a place to find community-led fashion projects that exist not led by market, but led by community that exist within the commons. It is a destination for clothing culture that is uncorrupted by profit and defined instead by purpose, meaning, and values. Much of this we have seen today in the stories from Pluriverse. We want to feature projects that exist to care for collective resources in fair and collaborative ways. And here are some a selection of things that we would love to see on the common market. Ways in which you can reknit, ways to grow dyes and dye your clothes, ways to collaborate, to upcycle, instructions, ways in which we can work together as community and participate in real clothing culture. So please join us. You can continue this conversation and sign up for Fashion Act Now on our website. You can also rewatch the films on the website, on our homepage. You can get in touch with us at hello@fashionactnow.org. And you can become a commoner at thecommon.market. Thank you. And I will hand back over to Belle.
Oh, it's nice to be here. We have 3 minutes left. There's so much to think about from tonight's event. I always find myself wanting to remind people, very much as I started, that we are in a climate emergency. I find that's really important to create as a context for all our thoughts and all our practices going forward. I would ask everyone to beware of the easy fix. There's nothing easy about this time. We're en route to 3 or 4 degrees rise in temperature, but we're actually seeing what's happening right now at 1.2 degrees rise in temperature, the melting of the Arctic, the loss of the Amazon rainforest. So I would like to thank everyone here for their attention and request that you continue this work in whatever way you can. I'm very, very gripped always by those who work within the industry, doing the best they can, but working within systems that they know are difficult for the planet. It's not exactly that my heart goes out to you, but that I have a lot of sympathy with your work, and that I would like to say that in many respects, working from the inside is very hard, and far harder in some respects than working from the outside. In my last minute, I would like to thank everyone here tonight. I would like to thank Sarah for driving the project, Sandra for her amazing thinking, Veronica for connecting us with Matico and her work in Ecuador, Jennifer just for being here and speaking so passionately about the women you work with in Africa, Susan, Bella, who I've interviewed before, Alicia for steering us so well. You never met her, but she was just brilliant behind the scenes, and Karishma for sharing your stories. I hope that everyone has a really good day or evening, and to see you working with Fashion Act Now in some form going forward. Thank you, everyone.